Hello folks, this is Liam Munasaki from the Master Lab Systems. So today we'll be looking at real-time data streaming with Apache Kafka and Python FastAPI. Okay? So let's look at the agenda we have for today. Basically what you'll learn is the importance of real-time data streaming, overview of Apache Kafka, and also building a FastAPI service to produce and consume Kafka data. Also looking at the real-world use cases. Okay, so why it matters? So basically, because of it enables real-time decision making, and also it is widely used by major companies such as LinkedIn and Netflix for streaming and Uber for processing as well. Okay, so let's look at the second slide we have, which is what is Apache Kafka. So Apache Kafka is a distributed event streaming platform. It handles a high throughput, low latency data feeds. Also, it is built for scalability, fault tolerance, and durability. Looking at the Kafka core concepts, we have the producer. So a producer is actually a functionality that sends data to Kafka, while a consumer is a functionality that reads data from Kafka. And also we have a broker, which is what keeps the data, which is a server instance for this matter, and also a topic, which is what categorizes which messages to go to which broker or to which instance. Okay. Looking at Kafka in action, let's look at the real world use cases for Kafka. Okay. So Kafka is very good in real-time analytic dashboards and also for fraud detection, log aggregation, and microservice communication. Looking at the last bit, which is the mini flow diagram that we're having here. So imagine we have a front end or a sensor that sends, that produces data or that sends some data to our Kafka producer using the Kafka topic. Okay, so Kafka will store those through that topic, and now it will processes that using the Kafka consumer to your FastAPI, and from your FastAPI project to your backend, which is your database in this state, and you get a response. Okay. However, we'll be looking at that in a minute on how we can do it in real world in action. Okay. So let's look at how we can set up our project. So the tools we need for this one, we'll need a Docker, a Kafka, and Python, and FastAPI. Of course, if you haven't set up Kafka locally, I would strongly recommend or advise that you look at my previous tutorial where I am setting up or deploying Kafka locally using Docker Compose. Okay, so once you have your setup ready, your Kafka setup ready, and you can see that your Kafka is running, and as well as your Zookeeper, as it is what Kafka uses or what Kafka relies on. So ensure that you have your Kafka running and your Zookeeper running to make sure that you can continue with this lesson. Okay. So, and then after that, we begin with installing Python dependencies, which we'll need for this in this case. So, of course, the ones we need FastAPI, which is a web server, a web-based server. Well, a framework, a web-based framework for Python, which is what we'll be using, and also a UV code, which is a web server to serve our FastAPI project, and also a Kafka Python, which is what integrates, or a library that integrates Python and Kafka. Okay. Before looking at the use case example, of course, before even getting in the action, let's look at the use case example. So a scenario we have, example, a live user activity feed, for example. So a front end would publish events using the publish function or the publish endpoint. So Kafka would process the stream, and then the consumer logs events or pushes to the dashboards. Meaning now, for example, the front end publishes the messages using the publish endpoint, and then Kafka will then process that using the producer, will process that and stores those to a topic in a broker. And then the consumer now, which is the Kafka consumer, will then get those logs, which is to pull those logs and pushes those to analytics dashboards. Okay. So as well, folks, let's go ahead and look at how we can do this real-time data streaming with Apache Kafka and Python. So first things first, I'm gonna take you to my Docker instance or to my Docker engine where I'm showing you that. Okay, so if we look at the Docker engine for this test, so as I said, first of all, is to ensure that your Kafka and Zookeeper, they are both running, to ensure that the integration is smooth. Okay, as you can see, what I have here is a Kafka image and a Zookeeper image. So as you can see, they are both running. So this is what I will need to ensure that you have a smooth integration. So ensure that your Kafka and Zookeeper, they are both running. Okay, so once we have this, let's go ahead to our IDE. Okay, first of all, before going to the IDE, okay, so as I said, we need a project. So let me do another cd dot. Okay, so what I want is that you go ahead to create a project. So as I said, I will use my basic project that I normally use. So here is what we have. So so this is the folder that we'll be interacting with the most. So as you can see, currently it's still empty. So what we need is a first file, which is the API that will contain the produce or the publish function, which is the endpoint. So let's have the API in there, not yet, and then let's go ahead and have a producer that will be used to produce those messages to our Kafka broker. So producer.py, which is fine. Okay, and then lastly we'll have a consumer that will consume those messages and print it to us or pushes out those messages to the dashboards. Okay, so which is now the consumer.py. So as I said, the main functionality for the consumer is to push either to read from Kafka and publishes to your analytic dashboards. But of course, for now, we'll just be reading the published messages to our Kafka broker. Okay, so now we have our three things: API, producer, and consumer. Okay, so as I said, what we first need is to get our dependencies in. So if I do again another dot, so this is the project structure, as you can see exactly how it looks like on the IDE. So if I close this, if I narrow it down, so this is basically the same view that you would get if you're on the IDE, as well as it's the same one, which is what you are seeing here in this case on my console. So basically this is the structure for the project. So let's go ahead and show that we are on the directory for Kafka, since we'll be working with that package. Okay, so if I do a cd to FastAPI, and then from here we need Kafka. Okay, and then let's do a list. As you can see, the three files we created, which is the API, the consumer, and the producer. Okay, sounds good. So now let's move on, folks. Okay, so let's go back to our IDE so we can ensure now that we start editing some code. Okay, so as I said, I have some code snippets that I would like to use, which are pretty much simpler and easily to grasp. Okay, so the first one, let's make sure that we get the API code, which is what we need. Okay, I'll explain the API, I'll explain the code as well. So we have that. Let's get the producer as well. So I'll also explain this. Let's get those fields in. Okay, producer, we have the producer, and then let's get the consumer, which is the last one we need, which is the consumer. Okay, let's get the consumer in as well. Okay, looking at the API first, which is the first file created. Okay, so what the API does, basically, the API contains one function or one endpoint, which is the publish endpoint. So this functionality, it will serve us, or it will give us a chance to be able to publish a message on the front end. By publishing that message, it will then be automatically sent to our Kafka broker, which will be stored to our Kafka topic. Yes. Okay, so the function sent to Kafka, it's what the producer has. So now if we take a look at the producer, so now we're defining here the Kafka properties, meaning the Kafka server, of course, Kafka is running at localhost at that port, and then we are ensuring that we are getting the data at that format, so meaning in a developer, that's what it means. So, and also we are dumping that. So basically either a developer or a dictionary, that's what it means. So this, and then our function that gets the data, so and the topic gets those. So I said if topic and data, if those are available, you can proceed to send to Kafka. Okay, that's what it means. So moving on, let's look at the consumer now. Okay, so basically this one, it normally works as a standalone because it just gets, or it just pulls what's available from the topic as latest as it can. As you can see here, earliest, meaning as soon as the messages they come, or the first messages to come, it keeps on producing concurrent, So gets the first message to come, it produces that, so it sends, it displays, in this case it just displays to us. But imagine you have functionality whereby it sends to the dashboard, to another application, or to your analytical dashboard system. So it will do that for that case. But for now, it's just going to tell us that it's received that. So, but anyway, we'll be looking at that, how it does it. Okay. So now that we have all of our three things we needed, so what I will do now, I'm just going to start out our producer, well, our API, just to ensure that our project is running. Okay, so if I go in again and attempt to start the project, so let's do the POE3 run. Okay, or the run command. So if we look at this command now, which is POE3 run UVCon, you see, which is the observer API, which is that file that we're invoking, and the app. So let's press enter. Okay, so as you can see, folks, it's starting up our web server or our Python FastAPI project. So now that we have in there, and also it is starting out, so what we need now, another page whereby we'll be doing what? We'll be running the producer or the consumer. Okay, so again, if we come in here, which is our folder, so now it means now we will be invoking what this time? The consumer. So when we publish a message on the front end or on the interface, or using that endpoint, which is the one on the API, we can be able to get the message using the consumer automatically or same time. So what we need now is for us to go ahead and invoke the consumer file. So as I said, if I do another list, so I'll do a cd FastAPI and let's look at Kafka. Okay, so okay, that's in. Okay, first of all, let's do a list as well. Okay. So now that we're in here, so let's open up our shell with shell to ensure that we can be able to run that file. So let's open up the shell. Okay, so from here, let's start the consumer now. So Python consumer.py. Okay, so now the consumer will also be listening. Okay, so let's go ahead and test to send a message. So if we do that, okay, if we do that, okay. So first of all, let's get that. Okay. Okay, so that is our Swagger running. Okay, so if for now, let's do a reload because of we need what? We need a Swagger schema. So again, this is the endpoint that we are referring to, which is the publish endpoint. As you can see, folks, this is only the endpoint that we will be executing, and also this is the endpoint, which is what we needed, the publish endpoint. So as I said, so meaning now when we submit a message, as you can see, now we are using the Swagger schema to interact with our API. So as you can see now, it's still waiting, the consumer is still waiting, it's still running, it's still waiting for messages to process. Okay, so the API will now attempt to send a message. So let's try it out. As I said, it's expecting what? A dictionary, meaning a given pair. Okay, let's go ahead and paste that. Okay. So for example, if we do that in, okay, so okay, so if we do that, and let's say we attempt to have it, so let's put it out. So user, of course, let's give it a user and say master lab is the user. Let's go ahead, add the second one, which is now the status, of course, or say the event, and then ensure that the event it's logged in for this method. Imagine you're processing login events, so it's important to be able to get those. And now lastly, the message or the status. Let's see the status. Basic trusted time data. Of course, if you had a real one or a real payload, then you would be able to use it. So a status and say maybe successful, logout successful. So that's what it means. It's the status for us, okay? But for now, that doesn't really matter, just for us to be able to test, okay? So now let's go ahead and hit execute. Okay, folks, as you can see that our payload was successfully submitted. As you can see, the response body that we are getting, its status message sent. That's our log message to ensure that if the message is successfully published or produced, then we get a response message saying the status message is successfully sent or the message is sent. As you can see, folks, now what we can do, let's go ahead and check on the consumer side to ensure that if the message was produced proper. Folks, as you can see, message has been received, user master lab, event login, and the status is successful. So this is how Kafka and Python will work in a real world scenario. So imagine, for example, if I do a quick example using a fitness application. So normally these fitness applications, what they have a sensor to sense your movement, of course, your physical movement. Perhaps you are a jogger or you are running, you get sensed, and then they check your BPs and all of that, your blood pressures and all of that. So it tracks your movement basically. It tracks your movement using that sensor that it has, and then that sensor, what it does, it publishes all your data to what? Using Kafka, of course. Once it publishes that data, and then you can be able to display, or you then be able to look to view your data or using your front end. So now your producer, your consumer will come, get your produced data and display it in a real-time manner. Imagine as you are running, you are able to view your movement reactions. So that's how this thing works. Same goes with those streaming applications. Okay, so now sending one last message, folks, before we end the session. As you can see, the message was successfully published. So again, that's how you were to use Kafka with Python. Okay, so imagine now as the data that keeps on coming, your real-time or your dashboards application keeps on getting the feeds. So that's what also happens. So imagine your sensors keeping on sending you the data, and consumer, they keep on publishing the data to your dashboards. So you can view the data at the real time as it comes, you are able to view it. That's Kafka for ourselves. Okay? So you are able to see how you can submit a message. So now I think I will close this for now. As you can see that. So moving on, let's look at now the best practices of Kafka. Of course, I always like to emphasize that it's important to use Kafka. Of course, we ensure that you have a security if you are running it in a production system. So also use a separate topics domain. Very important not to ensure that you have all your data in one topic, which is sometimes may cause some bottlenecks in your data. Also enable some schema validation to ensure the integrity of the data you are working with, so it doesn't break Kafka. Because sometimes imagine, let me quickly show you this before we end this. Imagine we are sending a data that was not in the key value format. So let's say, for example, we are sending a string. So, and this is a test message. So let's look at the response we'll be getting from Kafka if you are to send a string, not a dictionary. So, which is very important to ensure that the integrity of your data you are using is properly formatted. Look at the response we are getting, folks. So as you can see, error, unprocessable input. So it does say that input should be a valid dictionary, not just a random text or a string. So very important to ensure that the data you are working with is processable, and it's in a proper format that Kafka can understand, meaning in a dictionary or a key value pair or a JSON format. Okay, folks. So that's very important to take note when dealing with Kafka. Okay, so I think I will be ending here, folks, for today. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel and share the video. Also, if you have any comments or questions, please post them in the comment section. I'll be answering those. Thank you so much, folks. Next time. Cheers.